My name is Ava Reynolds. I'm 34 years old, and 10 years ago my father told me something that didn't just hurt me, it defined the way I saw myself for years. We were sitting at our kitchen table in Columbus, Ohio, the same table where every serious conversation in our house took place. It was early evening, sunlight coming in through the window, soft enough to make everything feel calm, even when it wasn't. My father sat at the head of the table like he always did, posture straight, hands folded like he had already thought everything through before saying a word. Ava, he said, his voice steady. College isn't for everyone. Some people just aren't built for it. He didn't hesitate, didn't look unsure, didn't soften it with humor. He believed it completely, and that certainty is what stayed with me. My mother sat beside him, quiet, her hands resting in her lap. And she gave a small nod, like the conversation had already reached its conclusion. Across from me, my older sister Rachel didn't say anything at all. She didn't need to. In our house, there were only two roles, the one who made everyone proud and the one who needed to be realistic. Rachel was pride. I was realism. And the thing is, no one ever said that directly. It showed up in smaller ways, in patterns that repeated so often, they stopped feeling like moments and started feeling like truth. The way my parents talked about Rachel's future, like it was already guaranteed, and mine, like it was something flexible, something undefined. The way teachers greeted her with recognition and forgot my name. The way relatives asked her where she was going to college and asked me what I was thinking about doing, like my life was still optional. Growing up, Rachel and I were only 2 years apart, but the distance between us felt larger every year. She was the kind of person who didn't just succeed, she made success look effortless. Straight A's, leadership roles, everything. My parents didn't just love her, they built their identity around her achievements. Her report cards were framed and hung in the hallway like artwork. Her trophies were lined up in the living room, polished and displayed like proof. Whenever guests came over, Rachel became the center of attention, and the stories always followed the same pattern: her success, her future. And me, I was the explanation. Ava's more hands-on, my dad would say with a polite smile. She's not really the academic type. It sounded harmless, even supportive, but what it really meant was simple. She's not like Rachel, and that was enough for everyone to understand where I stood. But here's what no one ever asked me: what if I wasn't bad at learning? What if I just didn't learn the way they valued? While Rachel memorized textbooks, I took things apart. Old laptops, broken phones, anything I could find. I didn't just want answers, I needed to understand how things worked, why they broke, how to fix them. I could sit on the floor for hours with tools scattered around me, completely focused, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. But none of that showed up on report cards. There was no column for curiosity, no grade for understanding systems, so in my house, it didn't count. Senior year came, and with it, the moment everything became official. College letters started arriving, and Rachel got into everything: Michigan, Northwestern, Georgetown, and then Harvard. The day that letter came, my mother opened it with shaking hands, and when she realized what it was, she actually screamed. My father stood up so fast, his chair scraped across the floor. That night, they opened champagne. Calls were made, photos were taken, relatives congratulated them like they had accomplished something themselves. My father raised his glass and said, "To Rachel, our future success story." Everyone cheered. Then he looked at me and added, "And Ava. She find her own path." That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else that night, because it sounded kind, but it wasn't. It was permission. Permission to stop expecting something from me. I applied to one college not because it was my dream, but because I needed to prove something, even if it was just to myself. The letter came 2 weeks later. Thin envelope. I already knew. I opened it, sitting on the edge of my bed, read the first line, and stopped. That night, my father knocked on my door. "I'm sorry, Ava," he said, and he meant it. "You can't force something that isn't there, but that doesn't mean you won't have a good life. You just need to be practical." Practical. That word followed me everywhere after that. 2 weeks later, Rachel left for Harvard. My parents drove her, spent days celebrating, posting photos, telling everyone how proud they were. I stayed home. No goodbye dinner, no conversation about what came next for me. Just quiet. That was the moment my life split into, not dramatically, but quietly, like something closing and something else opening. I got a job at a small electronics repair shop, minimum wage, fixing cracked screens and replacing batteries. It wasn't impressive, not in the way my family defined success, but something changed there. For the first time in my life, things made sense. A device came in broken, I fixed it. No opinions, no comparisons, just a clear problem and a clear solution. And I got good at it, really good. Customers started asking for me by name. Within a year, I was running most of the technical work in the shop. By 22, I understood systems better than most people with degrees. But to my family, none of that mattered because I didn't have a diploma. Rachel graduated top of her class. Of course she did, and she got a job at a fast-growing tech company. My father talked about it like it was his accomplishment. I saw Rachel maybe twice a year after that. One time she looked around my small apartment and asked, "Have you ever thought about going back to school?" Not in a cruel way, just confused. Like she couldn't understand how my life had turned out this way. By 25, I had saved enough to take a risk. I started refurbishing laptops and selling them online from my living room. The first year, I barely made anything. The second year, it started to grow. By the third year, I hired someone. By the fifth, I had a warehouse, then another, then contracts, then growth I didn't expect. And I didn't tell my parents because part of me still remembered that kitchen table, still carried that version of myself they believed in. Then, one morning, everything changed. My operations manager placed a document on my desk. At the top, it said Bright Core Solutions. They were struggling and they were up for acquisition. I stared at that name for a long time. Then, I smiled. Because Rachel still worked there. My parents still bragged about it. It was still their definition of success. And I realized I was in a position to buy it. Not as revenge, not even as proof, but because I could. The process took months. Meetings, negotiations, risk assessments. At 32 years old, I became the majority owner of Bright Core Solutions. The day I walked into the building, no one recognized me until I stepped into the conference room and said, "Good morning, I'm Ava Reynolds, your new CEO." The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had ever experienced. My father stared at me like he didn't recognize the person in front of him, and Rachel looked like she was trying to rewrite reality in her head. "Ava," he said finally. "Yes," I replied. "You bought the company." "Yes." "How?" I looked at him and said, "I built something of my own first." And in that moment, I didn't feel anger or satisfaction or even validation. I felt clarity. Because everything they thought I couldn't do, I had already done. And I didn't need them to believe it anymore. The truth was already there. After that meeting, no one moved right away. The room stayed suspended in that strange silence where everyone knows something irreversible just happened but hasn't figured out how to respond yet. Rachel was the first to break eye contact. She looked down at the table, then at the documents in front of her, like she was trying to find something familiar to hold on to. My father didn't sit. He stayed standing, one hand gripping the back of his chair, his knuckles pale. For the first time in my life, he didn't look certain, and I realized something in that moment that I hadn't expected die. Didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel like I had won anything. I just felt steady. Like I had finally caught up to a version of myself that had been waiting for me for years. The meeting continued because it had to. Numbers were discussed, timelines, restructuring plans, operational changes. My voice stayed calm, precise, professional. I outlined the direction I intended to take the company. No one interrupted me. No one challenged me. Not because they fully understood what was happening, but because the authority in the room had already shifted. Rachel didn't speak once. Not a single question. Just silence. My father watched me not the way he used to, not with dismissal or quiet judgment, but like he was trying to understand something that didn't match the version of me he had carried for years. When the meeting ended, people filed out slowly, murmuring, glancing back at me with curiosity and disbelief. Rachel stayed seated. My father did too. The door closed, and suddenly it was just the three of us. "You should have told us," my father said finally. It wasn't anger. It was confusion. I looked at him and said quietly, "I tried, a long time ago." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Rachel spoke next, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. "You built all of this. By yourself." I nodded. "Yes." She shook her head slightly. "I didn't know," she said, and I believed her. For all the attention she had received growing up, she had never really looked at me closely enough to see what I was becoming. Not out of cruelty, just absence. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my career. Not because of the business itself, but because of what it required from me emotionally. Brightcore wasn't just another company. It was layered with history. The problems ran deeper than the reports showed. Departments were disconnected. Leadership was reactive. Decisions had been made to protect appearances instead of stability. It reminded me of something familiar. The company hadn't failed all at once. It had failed slowly, through small choices no one questioned. I worked longer hours than ever before. Not to prove anything, but because I understood what needed to be done. I restructured teams, cut unnecessary expenses, redirected investments, and rebuilt the culture. I encouraged questions, rewarded problem solving, paid attention to people who thought differently. And slowly, things began to change. Productivity improved, morale shifted, the company stabilized, not overnight, but steadily. Rachel reported directly to me now. At first, our interactions were strictly professional, emails, meetings, minimal conversation. She was cautious, like she didn't know what version of me to expect. One evening, after most people had left, she knocked on my door. "I owe you an apology," she said. The words came slowly, like she had practiced them. I didn't interrupt. "I didn't take you seriously," she continued. "Not when we were younger. Not after." She paused. "You never thought I'd build something real," I finished. She nodded. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," she said. "I know," I replied. "But you didn't need to try." The words weren't harsh, just honest. She exhaled slowly. "I see you now," she said. I held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. "That's enough," I replied. And for the first time in our lives, it felt like we were standing on the same level. Not because I had risen above her, but because the distance between us had finally closed. My father took longer. Our interactions stayed brief and formal. But one afternoon, he asked to speak privately. We sat across from each other. Not at the head of the table this time. "I was wrong," he said. No excuses, no explanations. Just that. I let the words settle. "I thought I understood success," he continued. "I thought there was one path, and I put that on you." He paused. "I didn't see you. I folded my hands. You saw what made sense to you," I said. "And I built something that didn't fit that." He nodded slowly. "I should have listened," he said. "I don't need you to go back," I replied. "But if we move forward, it has to be different." "It will be," he said. And this time, I believed him. Months passed. The company transformed, revenue stabilized, new partnerships formed, growth returned. But more importantly, the foundation was stronger. One evening, I stood in my office looking out at the city, and I thought about that kitchen table, about the version of me sitting there, hearing those words. If I could go back, I wouldn't change it. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it forced me to find my own way. I realized then that success wasn't becoming CEO. It wasn't buying the company. It wasn't even hearing my father admit he was wrong. It was every decision I made when no one was watching. Every risk I took when nothing was guaranteed. Every time I kept going. And the truth is, they weren't entirely wrong. I wasn't built for college. I wasn't built for their version of success. I was built for something else entirely. And it took me years to understand there was nothing wrong with that. In the months that followed, something subtle but undeniable began to change, not just inside the company, but inside me. For years, my life had been driven by momentum, by survival, by the quiet need to prove something I never fully named. But now that I was here, now that I had built something real, I found myself asking a different question. What comes after proving them wrong? It turned out that question was harder than everything that came before it. Because proving someone wrong gives you direction, it gives you fuel. But when that fuel runs out, when there's nothing left to fight, you're left with yourself. And for the first time in my life, I had to figure out what I actually wanted. Not in reaction to someone else's expectations, but on my own terms. Brightcore continued to stabilize under my leadership, and with that came visibility. My name started appearing in places I used to read about other people. Headlines tried to tell my story, but they focused on the outcome, not the years of invisibility that made it possible. One evening, I sat alone in my office, looking at an interview outline someone had prepared for me. It was polished, structured, impressive, but something about it felt off. It was accurate, but it wasn't true, because it didn't include the quiet years, the doubt, the uncertainty, the small decisions that built everything piece by piece. And I realized something important. If I was going to tell my story, it had to be honest. Not impressive. Honest. Because somewhere out there, someone was sitting at their own version of that kitchen table, being told what they weren't capable of. And they didn't need a perfect story. They needed a real one. So when the interview happened, I didn't follow the script. I told the truth. About failing, about not fitting into traditional systems, about building something without validation. And the response was different, not louder, not bigger, just real. Messages started coming in. From people I had never met, students, employees, parents, people who saw themselves in parts of my story. And for the first time, I understood that what I had built wasn't just a company. It was proof. Proof that there isn't only one way to succeed. Rachel noticed the change to our relationship had settled into something steady, not defined by comparison anymore, just honest. One evening, she said, I used to think success was about getting everything right the first time. I looked at her, and now, I asked, she smiled slightly. Now I think it's about understanding when things go wrong and what to do next. I nodded because I understood that completely. My father changed it slowly, but in a way that mattered more. He started asking real questions, listening without trying to lead the answer. One evening, he asked, when did you stop trying to prove things to us? I thought about it. It wasn't one moment, I said. It was a series of them. Every time I tried and nothing changed. And then, he asked, I stopped trying to be seen, I said, and started building something that didn't depend on it. He didn't respond right away, but I could tell he understood. As the year came to an end, Brightcore wasn't just stable, it was thriving. But more importantly, I wasn't building it to prove anything anymore. I was building it because it made sense to me, because it felt right. One night, standing alone in my office, I thought about how far everything had come. And I realized something simple. My life wasn't a reaction anymore. It was a choice. I wasn't the girl at that kitchen table. I wasn't the version of myself that needed approval. I was someone who had built something on her own terms. And that changed everything. Over time, I started noticing something else. The people joining the company were different. Not perfect resumes, not traditional paths, but thinkers, builders, problems, people who reminded me of myself. So I changed how we hired. Less focus on credentials, more focus on how people think. At first, there was resistance. We need proven backgrounds, someone said. I asked one question. What did our old system produce? That ended the conversation, because the answer was already clear. The results spoke for themselves. The company didn't just improve, it became something better, something alive. One day, an employee stopped me and said, "Thank you." "For what?" I asked. "For seeing how I think," she said. I've never had that before. And in that moment, I realized that mattered more than anything else. At home, things changed too. My parents visited more, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. One evening, my mother said, "You've built a nice life." I smiled slightly. "I like it," I said. She nodded. "I wish I had said that sooner." "You're saying it now?" I replied. And that was enough. My father, in his own way, showed respect differently. Less talking, more listening. One day, he said, "I thought success could be predicted." I shook my head. "It can't." He nodded slowly. "I see that now." Rachel and I found something new too. Not closeness the way people expect, but respect, equality, and that mattered more. Over time, the story people told about me changed. But I understood something important. Stories get simplified. The truth doesn't. Because there was never one moment that changed everything. Just small decisions. Repeated over time, and that's what built it all. Being underestimated isn't always a disadvantage. Sometimes it gives you space. Space to fail, space to learn, space to build something real. And by the time people notice, it's already there. I don't think about that kitchen table as much anymore. Not because it didn't matter, but because it was just the beginning, not the definition. If I could say something to the girl sitting there that day, I wouldn't tell her to prove them wrong. I'd tell her something simpler. Trust the way you see things, even if no one else understands yet. Because that difference, that's what builds everything. And eventually, it becomes impossible to ignore. I didn't focus on confidence. I focused on understanding. He frowned slightly. "Understanding what? The system," I replied. "The way different parts of the company interact, where the pressure points are, where small changes create larger effects over time. Once you understand that, the decisions aren't about confidence anymore. They're about alignment." The room was quiet for a second, not because they didn't understand, but because the answer didn't fit the usual narrative. That was fine. It didn't need to. The meeting continued, moving through the agenda without friction. By the time it ended, there were no unresolved questions, no lingering doubts, just direction. At noon, the strategy session brought a different kind of energy. Smaller group, more discussion, more room for ideas to be challenged and reshaped. Rachel was there, seated across from me, reviewing projections. A year ago, that dynamic would have been heavy, with everything unspoken. History, comparison, distance. Now, it felt normal. Not because the past didn't exist, but because it no longer dictated the present. At one point, she pushed a document toward me. "If we shift the rollout timeline by 3 months, we can allocate more resources to development," she said. I scanned it carefully. "What's the trade-off?" "Short-term visibility," she said. "Less to show next quarter, but stronger long-term results." I looked up at her. There was no hesitation, no performance, just clarity. I nodded. "Do it." No debate. No overanalysis, because the reasoning held. And that's what mattered. The afternoon passed in focused conversations, decisions stacking naturally on top of each other, not because the work was easy, but because I wasn't carrying anything extra into it. No need to prove, no need to defend, just the work itself. By the time I left, the sky had shifted into deep blue. I drove home without turning on the radio, letting the quiet stretch around me. When I walked inside, the house felt different. Not just mine. Shared, a jacket on a chair, a mug on the counter, things that once would have bothered me. Now, they grounded me. A reminder that this life wasn't built in isolation. It included other people, because I chose to let them in. I set my keys down and paused. This was the part no one talks about. Not the climb, not the breakthroughs, just this. The quiet continuation of a life that finally feels like your own. No audience, no expectations, just you living it. And maybe that's the real ending. Not closure, not perfection. Just not needing either anymore. The next morning didn't feel different. But I noticed more. The heating system clicking off. Light hitting the floor unevenly. The faint hum of traffic. Small things, constant things. Things I used to miss. I stood by the window with coffee, watching the neighborhood wake up. A man walking his dog. A delivery truck stopping. Someone laughing in the distance. Life moving forward. And I realized something. For a long time, I lived like my life was happening somewhere else. Like I had to reach a point before I could exist in it, but I was already here. I always had been. My phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. Board follow-up. Nothing urgent. I read it. Took a sip of coffee. No pressure, just part of the day. Success had changed. It wasn't something I was chasing anymore. It was something I was maintaining, building, and sustaining. There's a responsibility in that, not just to others, but to the version of yourself who started it all. The one without guarantees, without certainty, who kept going anyway. I grabbed my coat and left. The drive was quiet. Not outside inside, no second guessing, no constant recalculating. That space had cleared. Not because I stopped thinking, but because I stopped doubting every thought. At the office, everything moved with purpose. The rhythm was steady. I walked the floor slowly. Not checking, just observing. Teams were working. Systems flowing. It no longer needed constant correction. That had always been the goal. To build something that could stand without me holding it together. I saw Rachel speaking with her team. She nodded briefly when she noticed me. No pause, no shift. Just momentum continuing. That's how I knew things had changed. Not just the company, but us. I returned to my office, closed the door. The quiet wasn't isolation. It was focus. I reviewed reports slowly, carefully, understanding, not rushing, because speed without understanding had stopped being useful a long time ago. Later, Marcus came in, interest from a European firm. He said, I scanned the details. Why them? Strong distribution networks, he replied. I leaned back, thinking, not reacting, not rushing. Set up a call, I said. I want to understand them first. He nodded, not committing. No, just listening. After he left, I sat quietly. There's a shift when decisions stop defining you. They become part of something larger, less final, more fluid. That evening, driving home, I passed a school letting out. Parents waiting, kids running. I watched longer than I needed to, not thinking about the past, just noticing the present. At home, the lights were already on. Inside, my mother was cooking. Dinner's almost ready, she said. I nodded. Smells good. She moved naturally now. Not carefully, not trying. Just present. You don't have to try so hard, I said. She looked at me. I'm not trying. I'm just here. And this time, I believed her. Dinner was quiet, but not empty. My father sat across from me, not leading, not controlling, just there. I don't know how to do this part, he admitted. You don't have to do it perfectly, I said. You just have to stay. He nodded slowly. We cleaned up together afterward. Awkward at first, then natural. Not repair, not yet. Relearning. Later that night, I stood by the window. The world outside was still. I thought about everything it took to get here. Not just success, but silence. And breaking it, there was no final moment. No perfect closure. Just continuity and presence. The kind you don't have to earn anymore. I didn't feel like I had returned to anything. I felt like I had arrived somewhere new. Not perfect, not finished, just whole. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like I was becoming someone. I felt like I already was. This isn't just a story about success. It's about being overlooked, underestimated, and still choosing to rise. It's about family, silence, truth, and what happens when the roles finally reverse. And most of all, it's about becoming someone who no longer needs validation. If you've ever been told you're not enough, this story is for you. Drop a comment. What would you have done in my place?